there's not a place to turn in the lab
No,
report?
it's not like on our list of things to do.
Okay, I will add that. You might want to shoot me an email to remind me to put that in there. Anything else?
And that's tomorrow. Right?
Yes, tomorrow like at midnight. Any other questions? Okay, let's talk just a minute about what I want you to know basically about plants. What are the general characteristics of plants? How would you say this is a plant and this is not a plant? What are the general characteristics of plants?
They're green.
Most of them are green. What else about plants?
Chlorophyll,
They have chlorophyll. What else?
cell walls,
They have cell walls. What else? Where do you find plants? I'm sorry? Terrestrial. What does terrestrial mean? On land. What do we call plant-like things in the ocean? Algae. Okay. Let's see, what else about plants? How do they get their nutrition? Photosynthesis. How do they, and we call them what group? Like, are they self-feeders or other feeders? They're autotrophs. They make their own food. Okay, what else can you tell me about plants? Are they unicellular or multicellular? Multicellular. Okay, and one of the unique things about plants is their life cycle. In animals, which is what we're most familiar with, we are unicellular when we're a zygote, and our gametes are unicellular haploids, right? But we have no multicellular haploid stage. Plants, on the other hand, have a multicellular haploid state and a multicellular diploid state. And we call that alternation of generations. So that's kind of unique to plants. So plants do mitosis in haploid cells. Animals don't do that. So when we say, one of the things when you're teaching mitosis in a class like this is like, how much detail do you get into? We usually think of a 2N organism going to a 2N organism. Well, the truth is a 1N in mitosis can also go to a 1N. N means how many copies of each chromosome, right? So, in moss, you guys know what moss looks, it's a little soft green stuff that's very short, is a non-vascular seedless plant. And what's unique about moss, besides the fact that it's seedless and non-vascular, is that, you guys online here, you know what moss looks like. What you see is the green plant is the haploid stage. And we call the haploid stage the gametophyte. So that's a term you need to know, gametophyte. The 2N stage, the multicellular 2N stage, we call the sporophyte. The gametophyte makes the gamete, sporophyte makes the spore. So for most plants, what you see out there is the sporophyte, except for moss and other bryophytes. Okay? So what you see is the 1N, multicellular. Not this time of year, but you will often find on moss these structures called sporophytes, which are kind of tall, stocky things, and that's the sporophyte. Okay, and this moss doesn't have any. I looked and could not find moss with sporophytes. Okay? The second category of plants, second major category of plants, are the ferns and fern allies. They are still seedless, they don't make seeds, but they are vascular. And vascular means what? They have what? They can move things around the plant. They have a vascular system which allows them to move liquid things around the plant. So plants have xylem and phloem. Xylem up, phloem down. So plants move water throughout the plant in the xylem, and the phloem is how they move nutrients. Okay? In a Fern, the major green part of it is the sporophyte, like it is for most plants. And the emetophytes are located in these little structures called sori, which are on the underside. I don't know that anybody can see anything there, but on the underside of the fern leaflets. Okay, but they don't make seeds, they make spores. Anybody wants to see this stuff, you're welcome to come up and look at it after class. The third category are the seed plants. Gymnosperms include things like pine trees. The needles are very different. These are the leaves. How are the leaves of a pine tree different than the leaves of other plants, of what we think of as regular plants? Most of the plants. They're skinny and long, and they're coated. If you were to touch them, what would they feel like? They're kind of waxy. They kind of have a coating on them. What is that for, you think? Protection from what?
Dehydration.
What?
Dehydration.
Dehydration from losing water. So these structures are water conserving. These are often evergreens. Most but not all gymnosperms keep their leaves all winter. They do shed though. They shed a certain percentage of their leaves every year. So they don't like live forever, but they just don't shed them all every year. Many gymnosperms make cones, and the seeds there's male cones that make pollen, and there's female cones that make the seeds, and those are down inside the little structures on the pine cones. And the fourth category of plants are the angiosperms, flowering plants, and I told you yesterday, not all flowers are really pretty, but the flowers are there to attract insects. There are anthers, and that have the pollen on the ends, and in the female parts, the pollen goes down, and they make seeds. So plants can reproduce either sexually or asexually. If you see a really nice plant somebody has, you can just take a cutting off it and grow a whole new plant, which you can't do with an animal. Okay? Do you have any questions about plants? Hopefully you have watched the video. If you haven't watched the video, you will not be prepared for the exam. Okay? All right. So, today we are going to finish our video. I've got the sound turned down right this minute, but I gotta move it up to where we were yesterday. See, we were getting ready to. This is about where we were. Okay, we did the bats. Okay, this is where we were yesterday.
Harry Irwin prepares to explore life in the treetops. He has designed a systematic way to investigate a realm that has long eluded biologists. Using the computer map, Irwin locates the trees in the plot laid out the day before. A specific tree is selected. Stakes are placed around its perimeter. Cone-shaped collecting trays are set in place, but the experiment must wait until the next morning when the air is still. Before dawn, the trays are ready. At first light, the experiment begins. A cloud of biodegradable insecticide is blown upward. A slight updraft along the trunk carries it to the top of the canopy. The chemical is lethal to insects, but after 2 hours, it is completely harmless. This single tree will produce an incredible 2,000 species of insects. Each species of tree has its own unique community. If there are thousands of different trees in the forest, the number of insects can stagger the imagination.
My biomass dropped out this morning.
Now the difficult task of sorting and identification begins. It is already apparent they are seeing many new species for the first time. It has been estimated that 5 million species of plants and animals inhabit the Earth. But Terry Irwin has a new hypothesis. He believes there may be 10 times more species than previously thought. We may be sharing the planet with 50 million other species.
How many species of ants?
On a single tree in Peru, 48 species of ants have been found, more than in all the British Isles. In the rainforests, trees are islands of life. There are less than 1,000 species in North America, but in Peru alone, 5,000 have been identified. Why does such enormous diversity exist in the tropics? Terry Irwin believes the rainforest is the cradle of life, a nursery where countless life forms unfold in new and wondrous ways. These creatures, distant from our own backyards, may seem alien and insignificant, but each is a unique experiment, a prototype in the evolutionary process. Diversity is the raw material from which new life forms spring. Here there are hundreds of variations on a single theme. Each is a specialist, one of 50 million moving parts, working in harmony to create a living machine, the world in which we live. The exploration of its vast dimensions has just begun. Yet will our journey come to an untimely end? It takes only a moment to cut down a tree.
Okay, this is part 3.
Southern California, an endless vista of urban sprawl. Once the last American frontier, civilization has now piled up along its coast. Linked by a vast network of highways, a megalopolis stretches all the way from Los Angeles to the Mexican border, except for 17 miles. North of San Diego, the United States Marine Corps base at Camp Pendleton was set aside in 1942 for training and maneuvers. Today, Camp Pendleton is the only major stretch of undeveloped coastline in all of Southern California. some birds rely on the cover of vegetation to protect them from predators. Other relationships are more subtle. Contrary to popular folklore, the roadrunner owes its survival to the coyote, the king of the chaparral. Here, over
I want you to think of, well, I want you to, I am not very well put together today. Okay. Can you hear me at all? Okay. What I want you to do, contrary to the cartoon where the roadrunner always gets away from the coyote, coyotes do eat roadrunners. So, but they've already told you that roadrunners depend on coyotes for their, to be alive. So I want you to think for the next few minutes, what could the coyote be doing and the roadrunner be doing that if you lose the coyotes, you lose the roadrunners from a ecosystem. So think about that.
millions of years, a delicate balance of life has evolved. Now it is threatened with extinction.
San Diego really looks like that. Has anybody ever been there? We went, took the kids there when they were.
In San Diego, exploding land values and population pressure have left the chaparral in fragments. Isolated pockets locked in a human grid. Finger canyons slip away from crowded mesa tops. Natural islands are surrounded by a sea of development. Crowded hilltops have slopes too steep to develop. Conservation biologist Michael Soule of the University of Michigan has come here to study how wildlife is affected by this fragmentation. His attachment to the chaparral goes back to his San Diego childhood, but life in this canyon is not what he remembers as a boy.
It is native California buckwheat, but the patches of it are so scattered. A lot of the introduced weeds are just more aggressive than native plants and outcompete them for light or for water. You look down the canyon, all you see are the introduced species.
New plants creep into canyons from homes and gardens above. Here, these silent invaders have quickly replaced the native species.
Okay, let's talk about that for a minute. Why would an introduced species, what does introduced species mean? What does it sound like it means? A new species that didn't evolve there, okay? So you bring in a new species to an ecosystem, and sometimes that new species then crowds out the native species. Sometimes it won't grow at all, but sometimes it will crowd out the native species. What would cause the new species to be able to completely overtake the old species? Why would that happen? Yes.
Like since people are growing,
I can't, I'm sorry.
like since people are moving into the places, it limits the amount of space for the ecosystem, so they're all competing for the space.
I'm still not.
They're
Go
like
ahead.
competing for the space to live there.
They're competing for the space, right?
Yeah, because like people are moving in, so it's limiting the amount of space that the ecosystem has.
Okay, but why are they being successful? Why wouldn't the native, you would think if the native things were always been there and if they're adapted to that environment, they ought to live better. The introduced species shouldn't be able to survive. But yet, Anybody been in southeastern Kentucky? Just go down I-75. What's growing everywhere? Kudzu. It takes over everything. But it doesn't do that in Japan. I think it's from Japan. Doesn't do that in Japan. Why does it do it here and it didn't do it there?
Environment?
Something in the environment. What is true of most native plants? They serve as food for animals, okay? And if you move a plant from its native area to a new area, and the climate's okay, the plant will still grow. But what about the predators that used to eat the plants? They're not there. So that plant can go crazy because there's nothing keeping it in check. So one of the problems with introduced species, especially plant species in particular, and a lot of insect species, is when they get moved from point A to point B, there's nothing to eat them. There's nothing to keep their population in control. But in their native areas, there's stuff to keep them in control. Nothing in the nobody eats kudzu. A few, I guess, some people will eat kudzu if they grew up eating kudzu, maybe. But it's not a plant that animals in the United States typically eat. So they can outcompete it, and that's what's happening here in the chaparral.
Over the past 4 years, Sule has studied 37 isolated canyons of different size and age.
This is a medium-sized canyon, about 20 acres. It's relatively pristine. It's about 20 years old. The habitat's in very good shape in terms of vegetation. But already in this canyon, we've witnessed the extinctions of two major birds, the California quail and the roadrunner. There's still rabbits here. There's still quite a few native rodents and quite a few native chaparral birds. What we're seeing here is an effect of isolation, an effect of fragmentation. This road right here is not very wide, but it's wide enough to prevent the movement of these birds and mammals into the canyon once they have gone extinct in this canyon.
In a canyon, the balance of life changes quickly. Sule wants to find out if the rate of extinction is related to the size of the canyon.
Oh yeah. Mockingbird. Oh, there's a jay there too. And a Bewick's wren.
In addition to birds, Sule and his colleagues also count the rodent population.
Big one. There he is.
It's a young female.
I'm not a field biologist. I would not be reaching my hand in there.
Neotoma lepida.
An annual census of birds, plants, and mammals reveals how many species have disappeared. By comparing the number of different species over time, Sule has discovered a critical link in the life of the chaparral.
There's 4 species. Harvest mouse, 2 species of woodrat, and 1 deer mouse.
Some species in some habitats or ecosystems are critical or keystone species, and if one removes those species, then a whole subset of the community collapses or goes extinct. And we're seeing evidence in this study that if the coyote is taken out of the canyon, that the extinction rate of the birds goes sky high.
Okay. Now we saw in the previous in part 1 when a particular amount of plankton went extinct that caused the collapse. So that was a keystone species. Okay, the plankton was keystone there. In this case, the keystone is the coyote. So usually the keystone species is either a producer or autotroph at the bottom of the food chain or web, or it's a predator at the top, one or the other. So have you come up with any ideas of how might the coyote being removed from an ecosystem cause the extinction of the roadrunner? Anybody got an idea?
So what if the roadrunner population increased first and then it would cause overpopulation? So
Okay, that's a possibility.
My thought was the things that the coyote would eat would start eating all the roadrunner's food,
The roadrunner's food?
or like what the roadrunner would eat.
Okay, that's another thought. Anybody else have one? That's close, but not quite. Yeah,
the coyote is the predator of the roadrunner?
exactly. I kind of gave you a hint there, but that's good. So what happens is, what he's going to tell you is, yeah, the coyote will eat the roadrunner, but that's not its primary food. Okay? So the coyote eats what mostly eats the roadrunner. So the coyote is actually protecting the roadrunner.
We lose a whole group of birds very quickly. So the coyotes turn out to be a very important strand in the web of life that is these canyons.
In this delicate web, the creatures of the chaparral are bound together in unexpected ways.
There's a roadrunner.
The coyote preys on raccoons, possums, foxes, and other animals that eat birds. Without the coyote to protect them, the birds soon vanish. When a canyon is too small, the coyote disappears, and the life of the chaparral collapses.
Species go extinct pretty much at a rate that the habitat disappears. The smaller the habitat, the faster local populations of birds and mammals disappear. And as the habitat is eroded by disturbance, the birds and mammals disappear at the same rate that the disturbance occurs.
Michael Soule has learned that the smaller the canyon, the faster life goes extinct. But in the end, no canyon is large enough. He estimates that in 100 years, the chaparral and all its life will be gone. His conclusion is sobering. When a habitat is fragmented, species become extinct. It's only a matter of time. What is happening to life in these canyons is happening across the entire surface of planet Earth. Scientists have identified ecological hotspots, regions where life is under attack. At this moment, on every continent, species are becoming extinct in numbers that rival the great catastrophes of the fossil record. As habitats shrink, the future of life hangs in the balance.
Okay, watch this real carefully. Okay, watch this green. So that's Mexico moving down into Central America, and then you see the very northern part of South America. There's Florida.
A great forest once stretched 2,000 miles from Mexico to Panama. Today, in northwest Costa Rica, only 2% remains. Here is perhaps the most endangered ecosystem on Earth, a tropical dry forest. Unlike a rainforest, it changes from season to season, and its soil is fertile.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a minute. We talked a little bit about a tropical rainforest. And what he's saying is a tropical dry forest is more endangered than a tropical rainforest. And the last sentence he said a tropical dry forest has what? It has what? Fertile soil and it has seasons, okay? In a rainforest, in a well, you know, a good rainforest, so to speak, there's more difference in temperature from 2 o'clock in the morning to 2 o'clock in the afternoon than there is from January to July, okay? So they don't really have seasons. But a tropical dry forest has seasons, mostly like a dry season and wet season. Obviously, they get less rain, that's why it's called a dry forest instead of a wet tropical rainforest. But the key is that the soil is fertile. Why would that make it more endangered? You would think that would make it more resilient.
The people who are cutting down the trees in the rainforest can go there and have fertile soil for a long time.
Yeah, so your soil stays fertile, therefore it can be used for agriculture for much longer periods of time. So there have been, back in the 70s and 80s, people were boycotting some fast food restaurants like McDonald's because they were getting their beef from cattle that grazed in what used to be tropical dry forest, because you could grow grass and corn and stuff, whatever the cows were eating. You could grow that much easier, and cows will thrive there. So they were cutting down the tropical dry forest because it's useful for agriculture. That's kind of the big deal.
500 years ago, Costa Rica's dry forest was larger than its neighboring rainforest, but it was also more vulnerable. Early settlers found it easy to transform the dry forest into pasture and farmland. Today, the fields are cut and burned to keep them clear. Herds of cattle graze peacefully amid the last fragments of the forest. Isolated patches are all that remain. Dan Jensen first came to Costa Rica 25 years ago. Each year when he returned, he saw his study areas disappear, and in 1985, he had a dream: to rescue an ecosystem from extinction.
Okay, now, the adventure you guys are gonna go on. Here. If I can find it. Okay. Now, this is the panoramic highway going up here like this, right? That's the La Cruz. What you're gonna do is go across the road and go.
With the aid of the Costa Rican government and the local community, Jansen plans to regrow 250 square miles of dry forest in what will someday become Guanacaste National Park.
The idea is to take these mahogany seedlings and put a mahogany population back into that piece of forest. So what you're gonna do, it's as if the seeds blew out there in the dry season, as they do, and then germinated nicely in the tree falls. So what you guys do is you literally take a bag and you walk around and you look for tree falls. You look for a place where the sun's coming down and there's a piece of bare ground there. You just plant it like that.
It's easy to plant a tree, but the complexities of restoring a forest are a far different challenge. How does one come to know the thousands of species and the role each plays in the delicate balance of a tropical ecosystem? Each day, volunteers collect mice for a study Jansen started 9 years ago. The ritual begins every morning after breakfast. First, the mouse is weighed. Tattoos identify him. Jansen knows this mouse well, as he knew his parents and grandparents before him. Mice thrive on seeds. Too many mice can virtually stop the growth of a forest. Tucked in his cheek pouch are seeds Jensen will later identify.
Which means it's the 1,208th mouse caught and marked in the flood since we began.
By documenting the balance between mice and seeds, Jensen has found a way to monitor the health of the forest. The mouse is returned unhurt to the spot where he was found, to be caught again another day.
Okay, pay close attention to this part.
Colorful and exotic, caterpillars are a paradox. They consume more vegetation than any other creature in the forest, but without them, many plants would die.
Why would plants die without caterpillars? They just said they eat more vegetation, so that's not good for plants to eat their vegetation. But if you didn't have the caterpillars, the whole forest would probably die. Everything would be gone. Why?
Because when they become the butterfly, they're pollinators.
Okay, they're pollinators. That's one reason. That's a big reason. There's a second reason too. Turns out.
With the help of 2 Costa Rican assistants, Jensen is conducting a long-term experiment with caterpillars. He is studying some 3,000 different species to see what they eat.
Llevar estos al frente para recorrer más fácil no hay problema.
For the next 3 weeks, this caterpillar will live in a bag until it becomes a moth. Jensen will then know how the caterpillar, plant, and moth are all linked together.
Very high tech.
Moths are important pollinators. Without them, many forest plants would disappear. The dry forest is also a breeding ground for moths that pollinate plants hundreds of miles away in the rainforest. Still, they have another role.
If you remove the moths from this forest, there would be quite a dramatic change because you lose major sets of pollinators. Perhaps even more obvious immediately, you lose major pieces of food for the bird community. There's a whole set of birds here who breed only on the caterpillars of these moths. So that if you lost the moths, you'd lose the birds.
So I didn't stop. I was out of the room when they were sorting the insects in the Peruvian. I dated an entomologist. I almost married an entomologist. So I have sorted insects. And what I was going to tell you is be careful what you do for love. I hate insects and bugs. I'm not a bug person. You'll do a lot of things for love.
See, when we say biodiversity, it's more than just a species. It's all the things they do to and with each other. And again, by plants, you can save an awful lot of species of plants from botanical gardens. But that's just saving individual pieces. It's not saving any of the interactions. And the interactions are what biodiversity is. And so when I say that we want to keep this place together as an example of tropical dry forest biodiversity, I'm referring not to the list of species that's here. In fact, if I had to give up and allow the extinction of 10% of the species to save the whole complex, I'd gladly dump the 10% of the species. Because the species are only a little piece of the whole biodiversity picture.
After years of painstaking work, Dan Jensen has conceived a blueprint to link the fragments of a dry forest together. His plan is elegant and simple. If pasture land is left untouched, seeds born on the wind will begin to take root. With new growth comes shade, and old residents return. Once the balance between animals and plants is restored, nature takes over and the forest begins to grow.
The Douglas dropped here back in April or May, and the tree seedlings are now growing very, very well.
Well, out here, the grass and the young trees are still mixed together pretty well. And it is a very brushy and trashy look to it, and there's obviously a lot of sun getting on the ground. But back here, the trees, by accident, happen to be closer together, so the shade is intense enough to have actually taken out virtually all of the grass. So in here, we're really far enough along so that it's the beginnings of a proper young forest. Because the grass is gone now, there's not much fire hazard, and it's shady enough so animals will walk through here freely, defecate seeds. A lot of circulation of birds through the canopy of the trees, they defecate seeds. And gradually now, this is well on its way to becoming a proper young piece of forest. Instead of being an old pasture with a few trees in it, now it's actually turned into an actual forest.
To help the forest regenerate, nature needs a little nudge. Mahogany seedlings are planted in open pasture. Their shade will lure animals from the forest. Eventually, a lost wilderness will return.
Humans, for millions of years, literally, have had the behavior of, instead of trying to live off of the wild world, you push it back and then put your own things in place. And those own things are things that are dependent on either corn plants or cows or deer or whatever they have to be, but they're something. Well, for millions of years, humans have been relatively incompetent at this game. So they push nature back and nature pushes back at them, and it's a balance. It's some kind of an equilibrium. Well, more rapidly in the last 1,000 years and almost with lightning-like speed in the last 10 to 50 years, humans have won the game over the entire surface of the earth. I.e., they've acquired the technical ability to obliterate nature. I.e., they've won. The problem is that humans are socially and genetically programmed to clean the field. Because always before, when you clean the field and you stop cleaning, boom, back in came nature. Now there's no more nature, it's just a neighbor's field. We're right at that stage right now where we have the option to wipe the enemy off the slate, or to keep the enemy there and recognize he really wasn't the enemy in a total sense, that he was something that was worthwhile keeping. That's a big choice for humans. The way I see it is that my job is just keep sending the enemy around until humans reach the level of social sophistication. So they as a group look and say, oh yeah, we really, yes, we had to beat that enemy, but we didn't want to sweep him off the surface of the earth.
The web of life in the dry forest remains infinitely complex. For Dan Jensen, a lifetime is not enough. It may be 1,000 years before the forest returns. But slowly, imperceptibly, it is inching outward. For the first time, an entire ecosystem is being rescued from the threshold of extinction. There was a time when we thought we could live without the wild things. Now we marvel at the beauty of the natural world. No creature is too great or too small. Each has a unique genetic heritage. It's linked to the past and to the future. Each is an exquisite creation in its own right, yet part of a living whole. But for the first time, the future of this web of life is threatened by a single species. We are pushing our earthly companions toward extinction 1,000 times faster than at any time in history. Scientists sound the alarm, while their work may offer hope.
The common pattern we see early in ancient mass extinctions is that they can be reversed. And so because we're in the early phases of our modern mass extinction, man finds himself in a very interesting role. He is not only the perpetrator and the potential savior of the global biota, but if mass extinction is allowed to go full swing, he may be one of the first victims.
You're programmed to want complexity, you're also programmed to eliminate it. Because for a long time, you couldn't eliminate it. All you did was you kept trying. And that was the way you survived, was by trying. Now all of a sudden you can. You win. You won. So now you have to reverse your own programming. It's okay. We're not going to go out there and put the screw to the last guy in the gun.
If we don't change the way we live, not only will the rest of the species on the planet be in serious trouble, but we will be too.
If we have the information on which to base our decisions about the natural world, we can make the right decisions. And that's what I expect in my eternal optimism that we're going to do.
There's never ever been a time like this. You see, all generations in the past have not faced this challenge because the problem wasn't there. And no generation in the future will face this challenge because we don't get to grips with the problem. There are nothing left except to pick up the pieces. We are really, you might say, a privileged generation.
Will we have the wisdom or the time to alter the patterns of history? Or is this the beginning of a long goodbye to the only home we know?
Okay, that's a little dramatic. I told you at the beginning this was, first three parts especially are kind of depressing, but that was not my intent. The last part I think is interesting because it really talks about potential ways we could make things a whole lot better. So let me see here. If we can get this next video up. Okay, now what I gotta do is pause so that I can get it here. Share.
This submersible is diving in some of the richest, most exotic, most unexplored waters in the world. Scientists aboard the sub, using its unique ability to chase and capture live fish and other creatures in deep water, are bringing back extraordinary sea life, including specimens of fish never seen by human eyes.
I saw more new critters on this dive than I've ever seen on any other dive in my life.
Okay, this is starting the
On
next.
expedition in the waters of the Galapagos Islands, they are discovering
the handout I
on
gave you
average,
today.
a new species every day.
The video was taken on this experience. Fish everywhere.
For a marine scientist, this is the ultimate.
It's our midwater squid. Those are actually sea cucumbers. And we've seen shallow water sea cucumbers. And now you're seeing what a sea cucumber looks like in the deep sea. These are really strange. This is a scientist's dream come true. To spend a month at the Galapagos, every day, in the water, in the sub, working with these animals. It's a high that will take a long time to come down from. But there's going to be a lot of work when we get home. It'll probably be 6 months or a year before we really even understand all the information that we've gathered from this expedition. But no doubt about it, Galapagos is Mecca for a biologist. And here we are in the Holy Land.
On station in the world's foremost natural laboratory of evolution. discovery expedition to the Galapagos, beyond Darwin.
We have a seal.
The Galapagos are dots of land on a vast Pacific. From the 1600s on, they were a lonely stopping place for pirate vessels and ships drifting off course. In 1835, these humble, unknown islands were visited by a humble, unknown scientist, Charles Darwin. He was the first scientist to set foot here. Now other scientists come in his footsteps, drawing on this almost magical source of knowledge about the evolution of life.
Absolutely. I'm so excited. I can't describe it. I gotta go warm up for you. Be able to explain it to you.
160 years after Darwin's visit, the Discovery Expedition arrived to gather new knowledge from these islands, from Galapagos worlds Darwin never saw, underground and underwater. The Harbor Branch research vessel Seward Johnson reached Galapagos after a 10-day, 2,000-mile voyage from its home port in Florida. Aboard were 38 people, the ship's crew, the Discovery film crew, and the scientific contingent. Spending 1 month in the spectacular waters of the Galapagos, scientists made 55 deep dives by submersible and many more shallow water dives by scuba. The submarine dives yielded fantastic deep-water specimens, many of them staying alive for hours or days, long enough for close-up study and living documentation.
Every biologist cuts his teeth on Charles Darwin and Voyage of the Beagle and the Galapagos. It's such an extraordinary place because the process of evolution occurs right before your very eyes. You can see how these different islands allow for the finches or the tortoises to radiate and speciate and evolve. But few people appreciate that the same thing happens underwater.
Charles Darwin, when he arrived here, didn't know about evolution underwater, or for that matter, on land. In fact, when the Galapagos offered him a hint of nature's greatest secret, he didn't see it. The Charles Darwin who landed on this beach was 26 years old, a medical school dropout, a young man whose sole passion was observing nature. Following this passion, he signed on as ship's naturalist for a 5-year voyage aboard the British survey ship Beagle. After mapping the South American coast, the Beagle started home across the Pacific, making a fateful visit in the Galapagos, 600 miles west of South America.
I have a hard time comparing what I do with Darwin too much because, to be honest, I think it's pretty egotistical, even though it sounds good. And when you go to Galapagos, automatically there are comparisons with Darwin. That's almost unavoidable. But Darwin was cutting edge. I mean, his observational ability was unparalleled.
But it didn't take unparalleled ability to observe the wonders of the Galapagos. Darwin beheld a fantastic spectacle. He saw giant tortoises, thousands of them. Birds with shriveled wings that had given up flying, but thrived as shoreline divers. Penguins and fur seals and sea lions, creatures associated with cold climates, but the Galapagos are on the equator. He saw land iguanas, resembling those he had seen in South America, but he also saw sea iguanas that fed underwater, a creature never seen anywhere else. Darwin spent only 3 weeks ashore in the Galapagos, visiting 4 of the 16 islands. He took notes and filled his bag with specimens, then he left. He may have had inklings of evolution, but he didn't see the light. Understanding what he'd seen and working out a theory explaining it took a quarter of a century. It's one of the great sagas in the history of science. Darwin's theory of evolution shook not only the scientific, but also the religious and social foundations of the Western world. The reverberations of Darwin's theory are still felt today, felt with a passion. It's the passion of fundamentalist religion, raging against Darwin, insisting on a biblical version of creation.
That was deeply forged.
It's also the passion of scientists who believe that Darwin opened new worlds of knowledge, who build on his insights in an ongoing process of science, who regard such fundamental evolutionary principles as natural selection as an unshakable premise of their work.
His closest relative is in Hawaii. You know, the irony of all of this is that here we are on a very, very modern ship, and in fact, with the Discovery program, we've had email, and one of the first emails we got was someone asking the question, did your experience with Galapagos change your view about that controversial theory of natural selection? My response was, Madam, it is not controversial. It's not a theory. It's a fact.
Okay, he's a little arrogant, okay? He is not my favorite scientist. Not in the world, not even on this video. So, you know, you gotta take him where he is.
I only wish that we could take everybody on this planet and send them to the Galapagos to see natural selection in action. It's so obvious here.
Aboard the Seward Johnson were 3 top authorities on sea life.
It was just crawling across the mile at about 1650.
The expedition's chief scientist, Dr. John McCusker of the California Academy of Sciences, an expert on shallow water fishes.
Well, okay, it's a little warm up here on top, so we gotta get in an ice bath.
I believe it's a Medusa, jellyfish. But
Dr. Bruce Robeson, a deep-sea specialist from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute.
this is what I've never seen before, and it's remarkable.
They do surveil of the new species of locust that we have.
And Dr. Grant Gilmore of the Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institution in Florida, an authority on Atlantic and Caribbean marine life, studying comparative evolution in the Galapagos.
Beautiful fish, very difficult to capture.
Well, as a strategy, I assembled a crew of scientists who could both examine the deep ocean, as well as the rocky reef, as well as the shallows. And then we threw in Stedman to give us a reality check. He's a birdman who's never been underwater.
The birdman was Dr. David Stedman of the University of Florida. Stedman is an expert on Galapagos wildlife in the present, but also in the past. As a paleontologist, he's done extensive work on the evolution of land life in Galapagos.
A big difference between what I'm doing and what the marine biologists are doing here is that, you know, I'm going into the past to look at evolution. So I'm digging down And by only digging down a meter, I might get back 10 or 15,000 years, but nevertheless, I'm going back in time to see what has happened evolutionarily. These guys are studying organisms that are still alive today. So the studies that they do are based purely on living fauna. There isn't a fossil record out here that would allow them to go back in time.
Darwin, not having a face mask, was unable to get underwater and really appreciate that evolution is going on there too. So I often thought, what would Darwin have thought if he had been able to do or work on to do on this expedition? Would he have realized that nearly everything underwater here has different factors affecting their survival, their evolution, which makes it more challenging and more interesting to an evolutionary biologist.
Also on board was a leading underwater filmmaker, Al Giddings. Giddings has shot underwater scenes in many documentaries and in feature movies including The Deep, The Abyss, and several James Bond films.
I've seen my fair share of the undersea world, but a lot that goes with the tools that we have here and the scientists that are on the front line here is incredibly exciting because everything that we're doing is sort of the first. Nobody's really gone below probably 200 feet here, so anything below 200 feet is relatively new to science or totally new to science. So I'm always excited to be on the cutting edge of that kind of new frontier.
I would be so seasick.
I believe this is the first time that any kind of research submersible has ever been available to study the deep living creatures that live here around the islands. Being able to be an explorer in the sense of a 19th century explorer, only one who uses 20th and 21st century technology to make those explorations is very exciting.
The urge to explore is timeless, but the technology changes dramatically. Charles Darwin's undersea technology was just a fishing line and a small tow net. His land tools weren't much better. On the Beagle, he was lucky to get a corner of a table as workspace. Except for mail at long intervals, he was totally isolated from the scientific community. Everything Darwin didn't have, today's scientists do have. For instance, this sun, the Johnson Sea Link. Don Lipitor is one of its two pilots.
This is Johnson Sea Link number 1. What you're looking at is the front end of the vehicle, and this is the acrylic pilot sphere. It's about 5 1/4 inches thick of acrylic, and the pilot and the scientific observer sit up in there, and all the controls for the submersible are up in that area. This is the hydraulically operated manipulator arm system. It's a 7-function arm, and we can grab things off the bottom with this jaw over here. Or we can collect fish by sucking them up through this tube. Once we pick them up, we can install them in this basket here. The lid opens up, and up on top of the basket is a 35mm camera that is laser aimed, so we can get the photographs in very sharp focus. Over here, we've also got a video camera with lights on it and lasers to document the things that we see on the bottom. And in the front of the vehicle here, this is called the lower work platform. It's a collection device where we have 12 plexiglass buckets that we can rotate around on a chain, so when we pick up a sample and put it in there, we can always have a fresh one available for a new sample. Down over here, this is how we drive the vehicle. Each one of these switches represents one of the thruster motors on the outside of the vehicle, and by throwing different switches, forward or reverse, we can get the sub to go forward, we can get it to go in one direction, we can get it to go sideways if we want it, or we can go up and down. Down in the center, we have our video control console, which is right up here, and this controls the pan and tilts and all the zoom and focus and different cameras, selects, and lights, and of course a video monitor so we can watch what's going on through the external camera. Should I be unable to bring the submarine to the surface, the first thing you need to do is to take my headset off, the pilot's headset, put this little earpiece in your ear, and press the button right here on the top of the box. It's labeled UQC, that's our underwater telephone. Should we be stuck on the bottom for a while? A while. The life support in this vehicle is good for 5 days. We've got enough chemical on board, we've got enough water making capabilities, warm clothes, and food to keep us alive for 5 days on the ground.
On the Discovery expedition, the Johnson Sea Link submersible entered this realm of life and color 2 or 3 times a day, diving by day or night. Each dive lasted 3 hours and carried 4 people, a scientist and pilot in the forward bubble, another scientist and backup pilot in the aft chamber with a porthole view. The sub moves under its own power and with no connection to the research vessel which hovers overhead, in contact by sonar and acoustic signal.
Right now, what we've got in front of us is kind of looks like a sediment and rubble covered slope, with not much here, not much on it, so it looks fairly good.
Yeah, Don, you're an hour into the dive. We just want to make sure you pace yourself to be sure we get time for the rocks that you need to collect at the time.
Deepwater diving is inherently dangerous, so every precaution is taken. A remotely operated vehicle guided from the ship is available to help rescue the sub if it became entangled underwater. In case of a long wait for rescue, the sub carries a 5-day supply.
Okay, make sure before Thursday, because tomorrow's lab day, before Thursday that you do the chapter on animals, the video that I posted on animals. I just got it up last night. So it's a whole bunch of short videos. You don't have to watch all of every video. Just watch enough to get a feel for that class of animals, or that phylum of animals, okay? You don't have to watch the whole video. It's just, if you enjoy it, that's fine. But you don't have to watch the whole video. Just watch enough to get a feel for what's unique about that particular